last lecture topic for this week is necroviolence. So what is it and how can we study it? And the particular case in which we'll be exploring it is relations along the US-Mexico border. Before I get into that though, this is the introduction to, our sort of discussion of the politics of human remains in the present. And your reading for this week by Parker Pearson deals particularly with looting and other sorts of atrocities within archaeology, introduces you to NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. There are a set of case studies within the chapter that I would expect you to be able to, summarize and compare on, say, a quiz, let's say. Politics nowadays of human remains, it's a very complex interrelationship among indigenous, academic, museum, and political stakeholders within this sort of era of NAGPRA. As of today, NAGPRA has been in existence for quite a while, but indigenous rights over their remains, over the funerary objects that are buried with those people, it's still a very controversial sort of issue. And when you're thinking about these case studies and reading about them, you need to realize that studying death does not occur within a vacuum, and there are all sorts of cultural, social, political, economic factors at play in how we interpret remains and the roles that they play in our politics today still. Okay, so just as a refresher from the last lecture, dealing with different sorts of transformations after death is the topic we'll be getting back into for this lecture. In particular, the use of death as a political statement. So this module highlights the work of anthropologist Jason DeLeon. He is a professor of anthropology at UCLA, and he is the director of the Undocumented Migration Project, which involves ethnographic, archaeological, and forensic research on social processes of undocumented migration between Latin America and the US. And he primarily collected his data between the years 2009 and 2015. And in fact, he was actually awarded a MacArthur Fellowship Grant in 2017 while he was still at the University of Michigan. So let's take a quick listen to him describing his research. Okay. All right. So to return again to this concept of materiality that we've been dealing with, when it comes to the study of death, and Jason De Leon's work in particular, he's using this model of object biography as a method of study. And so an object biography is a theoretical perspective and methodological tool to elucidate the relationship between people and objects. When it comes to post-mortem biographies of the dead, then, what he looks at, or what we can look at, are the socio-political context of the burials, the agency of corpses, as well as the political afterlives of the bodies. And hopefully that became clear in our discussion of the archaeological case studies in the last lecture. So what is necroviolence? Well, according to Jason De Leon, it is violence performed and produced through the specific treatment of corpses that is perceived to be offensive, sacrilegious, or inhumane by the perpetrator, the victim, and her or his cultural group, or both. So this can also be viewed as a sort of hostility directed at the dead. We looked at this as the concept of overkilling and Zompolis, these ridiculous amounts of human sacrifice that took place. Necroviolence is also a tool to alienate victims from a social context so that the spectators can feel some sort of moral superiority. And there's really a focus on the corporeal mistreatment, so the bodily mistreatment and generative capacity for violence that these people are subjected to. So as I just said, yes, necroviolence, post-mortem violence aimed at a victim's spirit, soul, or afterlife. The robbing of funerary rites. So if you're familiar with the story of Troy, the historic city of Troy, this is depicting Achilles riding and past the gates of Troy, dragging Hector's body behind him, because this is this ultimate symbol of disrespect towards his body and towards his enemy. Okay, necroviolence then involves the manipulation of the dead body as a vector for violent messages directed at the living themselves. So, for example, the erasure of group members that perpetrated some sort of indiscretion. This is involved in the construction of authority that's meant to suppress opposition within societies. We see this amongst drug cartel violence directed at corpses of their enemies. Necroviolence is also seen as the complete destruction of a corpse. That's often a very political sort of act. In this case, it allows violators to have plausible deniability. It robs the enemy of their voice and their agency, confines them to just remains as a thought. You can think of dissidents during Argentina's Dirty War, or next week we'll take a look a little closer at the missing students in Guerrero. And it also prevents a proper burial for the dead. So this is very important when we think back to the theories of grief, how we process death and burial as a rite of passage. If you don't have the body, or if the body has been completely mutilated, it sort of stunts this negotiation and renegotiation of the deceased position within the living community. These types of ambiguous losses, it sort of freezes that grief process and renders closure impossible. Necropolitics, then, is the killing in the name of sovereignty. And what we mean by sovereignty is this sort of supreme power or authority. In that way, the ways in which death and the right to kill are exercised in contemporary forms of political power. So this isn't always a bad thing for states or countries, if you think about wars or national security, but that's also subject to the influence of the political leaders, the media, etc., how these things are actually interpreted. Now, when it comes to De Leon's work, he actually, as he said, is trained as an archaeologist, but is dealing much more in the cultural anthropology sort of side of things, but still putting to use what we call experimental archaeology. And that is defined as, a way of testing archaeological hypotheses through experiments that are meant to replicate past conditions. We see examples of this when it comes to, experimenting with ancient pottery or stone tool making. The construction of houses using traditional techniques are decent examples of that. In his research, though, we're talking about taphonomies of violence. So that's understanding the post-mortem events that impact the corpse, and particularly the corpse of deceased migrants here in the Arizona desert. This could also be viewed as a sort of necroviolence outsourced to nature. So no human is actually physically doing the necroviolence, but they're just sort of allowing nature to take its course. Also using experimental archaeology in his materiality of border crossing, so trying to understand the experiences of migrants while they're crossing the border. What I mean by taphonomy is the study of how organisms decay and become fossilized or preserved in the archaeological record. So when we're talking about his work, he is seeking to illuminate the destructive and inhumane elements of taphonomy and the production of violence in the Arizona desert. Now, they don't actually use real bodies in their experiments. They use dead pigs as proxies for the humans that are left to die in the desert, and they leave them in different sorts of conditions, in the shade, in direct sun, wearing clothing, not wearing clothing. I mean, there's all kinds of variables that they're trying to account for in their research. They record the process of decomposition in extreme detail, and we often actually, what they end up observing is rapid destruction caused by taphonomic processes that he interprets as an undercounting then of the deceased. So not only just exposure to the elements leading to rapid decay, but as you can see in the picture here, scavengers coming by and destroying the remains, basically consuming them, and we won't find those bodies ever in the desert. Especially when scavengers are involved, we see the movement of clothing, the scattering of the remains can be quite wide in these sorts of cases. And so through their efforts, they are trying to document and publicize both common and inhumane ways of dying. Now, why do this? So when you listen to the podcasts that are part of this week's activity, hopefully you'll gain a better understanding of that. But the sorts of questions that he's really trying to deal with are, what is the role of political entities in border crossing deaths? What is this experience like for migrants? Why do they make these incredible journeys? And what is the experience of dying while making a border crossing like for migrants? Now, as part of the Undocumented Migration Project, there is an art exhibit that's going to be traveling in the next year. It's supposed to have launched in 2020, but because of COVID, they, held things back a bit. It's a photo ethnography exhibit called Hostile Terrain 94. And it's a participatory art project sponsored and organized by UMP. And the exhibition is composed of over 3,200 handwritten toe tags that represent migrants who have died trying to cross the Sonora Desert of Arizona between the mid-1990s and 2019. These tags are geolocated on a wall map of the desert showing the exact location where remains were found. And so this installation is going to be touring nationally and globally, like I said, in the next year. I would click the link here on the slide to see the closest place you can hopefully go and see this exhibit for yourself.